I'd like to talk to you today for a little while on the subject of vows. Vows. The practice of making vows is not taught on a regular basis in most denominations, let alone in churches. Very seldom mentioned at all. And yet teaching about vows is all through our Bibles. And you'll find it's literally scattered with people who made vows. Making a vow to God is a most serious thing to do, for after God has done what you asked in your vow, if you should fail to fulfill your part of it, it may even cost you your life. You might see that in one of our readings later on. So do not vow lightly or thoughtlessly to or before God. In my native Scottish society, the most common vows anyone knows about are the wedding vows. Promises made before witnesses in the presence of our holy God make them serious indeed. And yet it's quite common for people to treat them lightly and to break them without a second thought. In a biblical vow, there are two parts, and in many occasions vows are made as a last resort in a troublesome situation. Here is an example of the kind of things people ask of the Lord. O Lord, if you will get me out of my troubles, then I will. And then there follows a promise to God to do something. Even today, many people make this type of vow in ignorance, not even knowing that what they are doing. Some ask for deliverance from addiction, or perhaps bankruptcy, maybe even some other difficult circumstances. A vow makes a call upon God in a more acute way than prayer does, and a vow is often the means whereby the divine intervention of God is obtained when prayers seem to go unanswered. Biblical vows, as I've said, are two in part and nature. In part one, God's part is laid out before him. This can literally encompass anything at all, as you will see through our scripture readings later on. The person making the vow asks God for whatever it is that they need. In the second part, the person making the vow makes a promise to do something, to provide something, or pay something once God has done his part of the vow. So now to our Bibles. Let's go firstly to Genesis. Genesis chapter 28 and verses 20 to 22. In this vow, Jacob asks for the divine presence and protection on his travels. He asks for food to eat and clothes to wear, and then a safe and peaceful return to his father's house. That is the God part of his vow. Jacob then promises to worship and serve the Lord as his God, and to regard a large stone pillar which he has erected as God's house, a holy place. And he goes on to promise to give a tenth of everything God gave to him. In other words, he would pay a tithe. Later on in Genesis chapter 31 and verse 13, you'll find that God reminds Jacob of his vow, and then he sends him home to his father's house. Let's have a look at first book of Samuel, chapter 1 and verse 11. This is perhaps one of the most famous vows in the scriptures. Hannah was barren. She longed for a child, not just any child, a male child of her very own. So that's what she asked from God. In return, she promised to give that child to God, to serve God all of his days, and he would be a Nazarite from his birth, neither drinking nor eating anything that came from a vine. In Numbers chapter 6, you can read for yourself and learn about the vow of a Nazarite. I think we should now go on and have a wee look at the prophet Jonah. Jonah, you may remember, was on board a ship in a vast storm, and the seamen took him up and threw him overboard into the sea. There he was swallowed by a large fish, and in the book of Jonah, chapter 2, we read Jonah's prayer from inside the fish. In verse 2, he asks for deliverance, and in verse 9, he promises to pay his vow with a sacrifice of thanksgiving. Please note that. A sacrifice of thanksgiving. Not burnt offering, not money, not a particular action. Thanksgiving. There are more vows in the scriptures, but these will do us for today. All of them have a two-part form, and they have something else in common. They were made to obtain God's help in very difficult situations. You may read of King David's vow in Psalm 61, verses 4 and 8. You can also read of his rebellious son Absalom's vow in 2 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 8. That failure to pay that vow cost Absalom his life. You can see details relative to making vows in Leviticus chapter 27, Numbers chapter 6 verse 2, and Deuteronomy chapter 23 verses 21 to 23. These are the teachings that were enshrined by Moses in the Jewish law. But don't get it wrong. Jacob's vow was made long before Moses was even born. And so vows were something that came down to us from antiquity and were not started by God's law, which Moses delivered to the children of Israel. Does God take making a vow seriously? The answer is very definitely yes, he does. Scripture is full of admonitions and warnings about paying your vow. I've chosen only 3 from the Psalms, 1 from Ecclesiastes and 1 from Deuteronomy. And they read like this. Psalm 50, verses 14 and 15. Offer to God thanksgiving, and pay your vows to the Most High. Call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me. In Psalm 66, verses 13 and 14, I will go into your house with burnt offerings. I will pay you my vows, my promised deeds, which my lips have uttered and my mouth has spoken when I was in trouble. And then Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 4 to 5. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. And then Deuteronomy 23, reading from verse 21. When you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it, for the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and it would be sin to you. That which has gone from your lips you shall keep and perform, for you voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised with your mouth. I don't think I need to read many more of these verses of admonition, because there are quite a considerable number. But these readings do show us how vows are regarded in Scripture, regarded by God, and how they should be regarded by his people. As we've seen from our readings, all the instruction about vows are Old Testament, and perhaps just one mention in the book of Acts. In spite of this, for me, the question is not, does this apply today? Or is this just Old Testament? No. The question for me is, does God regard vows made today? Can we obtain divine help by making a vow today? My answer to the questions is obviously yes. And I'd like to inform you that there are people who have made vows on several occasions and seen God move in wonderful ways, and they have paid their vows. One of the possibly the most well-known individual who makes vows is Pastor Benny Hinn, the healing evangelist. He started making vows when he was a teenager, and he has made several vows throughout his time of ministry. And he even found out that his mother had made a vow, a Hannah-type vow. After she had delivered 2 little girls, she wanted a little boy, and she made a vow. All of these vows were fulfilled. Oral Roberts was another healing evangelist. He discovered that his mother made a vow, and that vow was also fulfilled. So vows made today are still honoured by God, and his divine power to bless his people is still available to those who make them and then pay their vows. Perhaps the question in your mind is, should I be making a vow? Am I in circumstances today where I would like to see the intervention of God in blessing? Should I make a vow? Well, if you're in difficult circumstances, if your prayers do not seem to be answered or considered at the present moment, then yes, you might undertake to make a vow. Be aware of this, that making a vow to God is indeed an extremely serious matter. If you went and studied about Absalom, you'd discover that that young man did not pay his vow. His heart was concentrating on rebellion and not on obedience to God. The result was that within his rebellion there was to come his death. If he'd paid his vow and stayed with the Lord, perhaps he might have survived the incidents that were coming to him. Who knows? So consider your vow carefully. Write it out, meditate on it, and then go somewhere quiet where you can draw close to God and present Him with your vow. And remember what you promise must be fulfilled. Thank you. Should you decide to make a vow and see the hand of the Lord work on your behalf and subsequently pay your vow, I would love to hear that testimony from you. You can send me an email at williamdouglasbell@gmail.com. Yes, you can send me an email at williamdouglasbell@gmail.com. Or you can write me a letter at Dr. W.D. Bell, 11 Belmont Crescent, Ayr, AYR, KA7 2NS, Nora Sierra.